The candles in the Pemberton assembly rooms had been lit for 2 hours when Lady Osmond rose from her chair and spoke Vivian's name across the floor. Not Miss Hartley, not the late Mr. Hartley's daughter. Simply Vivian, the way one names a piece of furniture being offered at valuation. And the 40-odd persons gathered for the season's opening assembly turned in their chairs to find her. She was standing near the far wall, which was where she had positioned herself when they arrived. Close enough to the refreshment table to appear purposeful, far enough from the center of the room to avoid the kind of prolonged scrutiny that had lately become painful. Her gown was ivory silk, that had been ivory silk once, then been aired, stored, and let out at the seams when the ivory silk of a better season no longer closed properly across her mother's figure. It fit Vivian correctly, which was the most that could be said of it. The lace at the cuffs was original. She had checked. She did not move when Lady Osmond spoke her name. Her hands, gloved to the elbow in white kid that had been cleaned with a damp cloth that morning, remained folded at her waist. She breathed, which cost something. What she did not yet know was that the Duke of Ashmore was standing 12 feet to her left, and that he had been watching the far wall for the better part of 20 minutes. Vivian Hartley was 23 years old and had been managing a narrowing world since the morning, 14 months prior, when her father's solicitor had arrived at the house in Brentwood with a face arranged into the particular expression that solicitors reserved for news they had practiced delivering. The debt was £3,000, secured against nothing a court would recognize, but against everything that social obligation in their particular corner of England had ever meant. Her father had borrowed from Lady Osmond 12 years before, when the family's circumstances had contracted and the family's pride had not. He had repaid £200 in the first year, then the harvest failed, then he had died on a cold Tuesday in November, leaving the remainder to accumulate interest in Lady Osmond's ledger and in his wife's silences. Mrs. Hartley was not a woman built for silence. She wore it badly, the way someone wears a borrowed coat, and it showed at the collar. She had managed the year since her husband's death by accepting invitations she could not reciprocate, reducing the household to 2 servants, and telling herself that the season would provide. The season's currency was daughters. Vivian understood this without requiring it to be explained to her, which was perhaps why the 2 women had not spoken directly on the subject in the weeks leading up to the Pemberton assembly. Some things are so plain that naming them is only cruelty. Lady Osmond occupied the chair nearest the fire, which was where she always sat, and which no one ever disputed, not because the chair was hers by right, but because 20 years of occupation had made dispute feel theoretical. She was a woman of 58, with the posture of a younger woman and the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was simply another form of winning. The debt had not concerned her when Mr. Hartley was alive. It concerned her now precisely to the degree that it was useful, and on this particular evening in this particular room it was very useful indeed, because the Duke of Ashmore was standing 12 feet from Vivian Hartley and had not yet attached himself to Cecily Drummond. Cecily Drummond was 19 and had known since the age of 12 that she was meant for a title, not arrogantly, or not entirely arrogantly, but in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has been dressed and educated and displayed for a specific purpose, and has never been given reason to doubt the purpose was achievable. She was pretty in the manner the season preferred, fair and composed, with a laugh she deployed at intervals calibrated to her mother's coaching. She sat 3 chairs to Lady Osmond's right, and watched the far wall with an expression of careful patience. Richard Fraser, 6th Duke of Ashmore, did not sit. He stood at the edge of the room's light, which suited him, wearing black still though his period of mourning had formally concluded, and he had come to the Pemberton assembly because his solicitor had told him it was expected, and because he had not, in the 2 years since his wife's death, developed a reliable way of contradicting what was expected of him. He was 34. He had the jaw the geological metaphors were made for, a face that gave nothing away at ordinary cost and only somewhat more at extraordinary cost, and gray eyes that had lately acquired the habit of finding the edges of rooms before they found the centers. They had found Vivian at the far wall without his having intended it. He did not know why. She was standing very still in a way that other people in the room were not still, and the stillness had drawn him the way stillness always drew him, the way water draws in the presence of a crack. She was not performing stillness. She was simply enduring. And endurance had a quality he recognized. Lady Osmond said Vivian's name a second time, louder, with the specific quality of volume that manages to be perfectly polite while removing all possibility of pretense. Miss Hartley. The correction came from somewhere in the room, a woman's voice, elderly, with the dry precision of someone who still believed forms of address were the last machinery worth maintaining. Several heads turned toward the speaker. Lady Osmond smiled, which was not a withdrawal. Miss Hartley, she repeated, her tone accommodating the correction without absorbing it. As her mother's daughter, she stands surety. The debt is £3,000, and it is owed, and it has been owed long enough. She said this pleasantly, her fan moving in slow arcs at her wrist, as though she were discussing the weather or the refreshments. I think we all understand what is required. The room understood. The room always understood this kind of thing faster than it understood kindness. What was required was a husband, or failing that, a patron, or failing that, a permanent arrangement of some kind that settled the debt and removed the difficulty, because Lady Osmond had been patient, and patience had a price, and the price was being named now, in public, in front of 40 persons who would remember every syllable. Vivian heard her own pulse in the side of her throat. She did not look at her mother, who was seated near the door, and had the particular stillness of a woman who has handed off a responsibility she cannot face. She looked at Lady Osmond, because looking away would have been an admission, and Vivian Hartley did not make admissions she had not decided to make. The Duke of Ashmore turned his head toward Lady Osmond for the first time in the evening. His face did not change, but his attention shifted with the specific quality of a very heavy object being repositioned, and 2 of the men nearest him took a slight step sideways, not consciously, the way one moves from the path of something large. £5,000. The room did not gasp. Rooms like this one did not gasp, because gasping was a loss of composure, and composure was the only real currency on the floor. What the room did was stop. Every movement arrested mid-gesture, fans pausing at wrists, glasses halfway to lips, a footman near the window going rigid with a tray in his hands. Lady Osmond's fan ceased its arc. "Your Grace," she said carefully. £5,000. He did not repeat it for emphasis. He repeated it because the first instance had been for the room, and the second instance was for Lady Osmond specifically, and the difference was audible, even if it could not be catalogued. It exceeds the debt, and it exceeds the claim. You will have no further occasion to speak Miss Hartley's name in this room, or in any other room where I might hear it. He turned to Vivian then. Not to the room, not to Lady Osmond, not to Cecily Drummond, who had gone very still in a way that was different from Vivian's stillness, the stillness of something rehearsed hitting an obstacle it had not rehearsed for. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, "I would be grateful for a moment of your time." It was not a question. It was not quite a command. It was the kind of sentence that is both, which is the most powerful register available, and Vivian recognized it the way one recognizes the weather changing before the first drop falls. She crossed the floor toward him with her hand still folded at her waist and her chin at the level she had learned to keep it, which was the level that suggested composure, whether or not composure was present. Her hands, inside the white kid gloves, were not composed. She chose not to let them say so. If you find yourself wanting to know what passed between them in the private room off the main hall, where a fire had been laid, and where no one followed, because no one dared follow the Duke of Ashmore in a mood of calibrated purpose, then you are in good company. Leave a comment below if you are already certain the story does not end where it begins, and then stay, because it is only beginning. He did not explain himself at length. He offered her a marriage of convenience, in terms that were plain enough to be respectful and formal enough to be a contract. His name, his house, his protection against Lady Osmond's claim, and in exchange, her presence at Ashmore, and whatever management the estate required of a wife. He did not offer her warmth. He did not, she noticed, pretend to offer it. There was a ward, he said, a boy of 7 years old named Thomas, who had been silent since his mother's death, and who had not responded to the tutors the Duke had engaged for that purpose. He said this last item as though it were a practical matter, but his jaw moved once after he finished speaking, in the way jaws move when a practical matter is not entirely practical, and Vivian filed this away without remarking on it. She said yes. She said it the way she had said everything since her father's death, in the register of a woman who has determined that yes is the only available direction, and who has decided to walk that direction without performing reluctance about it. They were married 9 days later by the vicar of St. Edmund's in a ceremony of suitable brevity. Her mother wept, which was either genuine emotion or the relief of a woman who has transferred a weight she could not carry. And Vivian stood at the altar in a gown of deep blue wool that she had purchased with the £30 the Duke's solicitor had advanced her without being asked, and she did not look at the door. Ashmore was 2 days by post-chaise from London, and the drive gave her time to understand the size of what she had entered. The estate revealed itself first as a stone wall along the road, then as an avenue of oaks bare in November, then as the house itself, which was Georgian and gray and enormous in the particular way of houses that have been enlarged across several generations by men who needed the space to store the lives they could not show. It rose against a sky the color of pewter, and Vivian looked at it without flinching, which she considered a personal achievement. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, met her at the door with the careful efficiency of a woman who had managed the house alone for 2 years and was not entirely certain she welcomed the alteration. She was 45, spare and organized, and she showed Vivian through the principal rooms with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory. The east wing, she noted, was closed. She did not explain why, and the evenness of her voice when she said it suggested the question had been asked before, and the answer had always been the same. Thomas was brought down at 4:30 by a nursemaid named Agnes, who had the apologetic manner of someone managing a situation that is not her fault. He was 7 years old and small for it, with hair the dark brown of old oak and eyes that were his father's eyes, gray and measuring and giving nothing away at ordinary cost. He stood in the entrance hall and looked at Vivian with the specific quality of a child who has decided not to want anything because wanting has lately been expensive. Vivian crouched so her eyes were level with his. She said, "I am Vivian. I have come to live here, which must feel very strange." He did not respond. He looked at her steadily for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the stairs. Agnes made a small apologetic sound and followed him. Mrs. Crane watched this exchange and said nothing, which was a kind of answer. The weeks that followed had a shape that Vivian recognized from the years after her father's business had contracted, the shape of a life being managed rather than lived. She took on the household accounts, which had been handled by the Duke's solicitor, and which bore the marks of a man managing numbers at a distance, various small inefficiencies accruing the way dust accrues in an empty room. She met with Mrs. Crane each morning, walked the kitchen gardens in the afternoon, and learned the names of the servants with the deliberateness of someone who understood that names were the first form of respect available. In the evenings, the Duke dined with her at the long table in the dining room, and they conducted conversations of careful correctness about the estate, the household, and occasionally the weather, and she went to her room afterward and sat by the fire and decided not to mind. She had not expected warmth. She had not been promised it. Thomas came down to the library one Thursday afternoon, when the rain had been falling since morning, and Agnes had run out of indoor occupations. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves with the focused attention of a child who reads, but does not yet know how to ask to be read to. Vivian was at the writing table with the household accounts, and she watched him for a moment without speaking. And then she said, without looking directly at him, "There is a copy of the Greek fables on the lower shelf, second from the left. The illustrations are better than average." He did not move immediately. Then he crossed to the shelf, retrieved the book with the careful handling of someone who has been told more than once that books are not toys, and sat down in the chair nearest the window. At 4 o'clock, she closed the accounts, moved to the chair beside him, and said, "Shall I read it aloud? The original Greek is better, but the English translation has a particular charm." He looked at her with his father's measuring eyes. Then he held out the book. She read until the light failed. She did not know. Until the following morning, when Mrs. Crane told her with an expression that hovered between composure and something that was not composure, that the Duke had stood in the corridor outside the library door for the better part of an hour. She did not know what expression he had worn. She did not know what he had felt, watching his silent ward hold out a book to a woman who had arrived a stranger and done the one thing no tutor or nursemaid had managed to do. What she did not know was that it had cost him something considerable to walk away. He had told himself, in the 2 years since Eleanor's death, that feeling was a mechanism he had put down the way one puts down a tool one has broken something with. Eleanor had been 29. She had been quiet and kind and had asked him for very little, and what she had asked for most was his presence. And he had been away at the estate's eastern accounts when she took the fever and did not recover. He had arrived home to a house already hushed, and to a child who had gone quiet in the way of children who have learned that speaking does not bring back what is lost. He had locked the east wing where her portrait hung, because looking at it was a kind of documentation of his own failure, and he had gone back to the accounts, because the accounts, at least, responded to attention. The day he stood in the corridor outside the library and heard Thomas's voice, small and uncertain, "Ask what happened to the fox." Something shifted in his chest with the quality of ice moving on a river. He did not go in. He walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window looking out at the bare oaks for a long time, and when he finally turned back toward his study, he understood that he had not bid £5,000 at the Pemberton Assembly simply because Lady Osman had been offensive. He had not admitted this to himself before. He admitted it carefully, the way one admits a small amount of water into a vessel one is not certain will hold. The days that followed had a different quality. He found reasons to be in the rooms Vivian occupied, not obtrusively, but with the persistence of someone whose feet have developed opinions his reason has not yet ratified. He corrected a mistaken entry in the accounts she left on the desk, and left a note beside it. She corrected his correction, and left a note beneath it. He read her note twice. He left it where it was. At dinner, he asked her once about her father's library, and she answered with the careful precision of a woman who knows that warmth is a risk and has not yet decided the risk is worth taking. And he listened with the stillness of a man who is storing what he hears. And neither of them said what the conversation was actually about. Lady Osman arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of December, unannounced, which was not unannounced because she had written ahead, but because the letter had been addressed to the Duke alone, and had been received and noted by his secretary without being passed to Vivienne. She came in a carriage with her own footman and her own traveling cases, and the air of a woman paying a social call that she happened to be very certain about. She was pleasant to Vivienne in the way that contains no warmth, the kind of pleasantness that one offers to furniture one has not yet decided where to place. She stayed 3 days. In those 3 days, she had 3 conversations with Vivienne, each one calibrated with the precision of a woman who has spent a lifetime understanding which words leave marks that cannot be attributed. The first conversation was in the drawing room, on the first evening, with Mrs. Crane and the Duke's secretary both present. Lady Osman observed that Vivienne was managing the household very creditably, given her limited experience of establishments of this scale. She said, "Limited experience," with the inflection of a woman saying it for the first time when she has been saying it for years. The second conversation was in the morning room, the following afternoon, with no one else present. Lady Osman wondered aloud whether the Duke had considered how Ashmore's neighbors would receive a duchess whose mother had required a creditor to resolve her affairs publicly. She said this while adjusting her gloves, her attention apparently on her own fingers. And Vivienne looked at the window and breathed and said, with the quiet directness that emerged when her values were pressed, "Lady Osman, I am aware of the origin of my situation. I find I am less certain than you appear to be that it defines its end." Lady Osman smiled. The smile meant that she had noted the sentence and would use it. The third conversation happened on the morning of Lady Osman's departure. Briefly, in the entrance hall, loud enough for Agnes on the stairs to hear. Lady Osman said that she hoped Vivienne would find the winter assembly pleasant, and that she had written to young Cecily Drummond, who would, of course, be attending with her mother, and that she looked forward to seeing how the season received the new arrangement. She said, "The new arrangement," in the tone one uses for something provisional, and she departed in her carriage with her footman and her traveling cases, and the distinct air of a woman who has planted something and expects to see it grow. Vivienne stood in the entrance hall after the carriage had gone, and understood that the winter assembly was not going to be a social occasion. It was going to be the same room the Pemberton assembly had been, populated by the same people who had watched her stand at the far wall in her altered gown, now watching her again, this time with the additional lens of Lady Osman's letter to Cecily Drummond, and the question of what the letter said. She did not tell the Duke about the conversations. She told herself this was because they were speculative, because she had no evidence that the letter contained anything actionable, because the proper response to Lady Osman's pleasantness was a pleasantness of equal composure. She told herself this with the discipline of someone who has decided not to need rescuing, and she almost believed it. The letter's contents became known 5 days before the assembly, when Cecily Drummond's mother called on the wives of 2 neighboring families and read them selected passages over tea. The passages described the Pemberton assembly in terms that replaced Vivienne's endurance with a word that rhymed with it, but meant something considerably less. They described the Duke's bid as the impulse of a man whose grief had made him susceptible to a woman of limited means and no establishment. They described Vivienne's management of the Ashmore household as the ambition of someone making herself indispensable before the arrangement could be reconsidered. This reached Vivienne through Mrs. Crane, who told her on a Tuesday morning with the expression of someone performing a duty they would rather not perform. Mrs. Crane said it plainly, because plainness was her way. And when she had finished, she looked at Vivian with the careful attention of a woman waiting to see what the other woman was made of. Vivian sat with it for the length of time it takes to finish a cup of tea that has gone cold. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Crane," and went upstairs to find Thomas. He was in the schoolroom with his current tutor, Mr. Pelham, a young man from Norwich who was conscientious and kind, and had made more progress with Thomas in the 6 weeks since Vivian's reading sessions had begun than the previous 3 tutors had made combined. Thomas was at the desk with a primer, and he looked up when Vivian came in with the expression he had lately developed, the one that was not quite neutral, that had something behind it she had learned not to press. She said, "I am going to the assembly on Friday. I wondered if you would like to choose which ribbons I wear." He considered this with the gravity that 7-year-olds bring to genuine decisions. He said, "The blue ones." She said, "Then the blue ones it is." She said this warmly, without performing warmth, and went back downstairs and stood at the window of the library for a long time looking at the oaks, which had been bare since she arrived, and which she had begun, in the strange way of prolonged proximity, to consider her own. The Duke found her there at 2:30. He stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way he had developed of occupying doorways as though testing whether he was welcome, and then he came in and stood beside her at the window. She told him about the letter. She told him plainly, in the register she used for household accounts, and she watched the bare oaks while she spoke, and she did not look at him. When she finished, there was a silence of several seconds, and in that silence she heard him exhale through his nose, in the specific way that was not a sigh, the way that was something controlled becoming less controlled. He said, "You should have told me sooner." She said, "I was not certain it required telling." He said, "It requires it." She looked at him then, because the shortness of the sentence had something in it she could not identify from the side. His face was arranged in its usual discipline, but the jaw had the tension she had come to know as cost, as something being held that wished to be otherwise, and for a moment, in the gray afternoon light coming through the library's tall windows, she thought she almost understood what he was watching for and what he was afraid he would find. She did not say this. She turned back to the oaks. He said, "Come to the assembly. I will be beside you." She almost smiled. Almost. The winter assembly was held at Pemberton Hall, which was the same room it had always been, with the same fire and the same candles and many of the same 40 persons, plus a rotation of new arrivals who had come for the season's second gathering, and who had heard, through various sources, that the affair promised more than dancing. The room had the quality of a crowd that has been told something interesting is going to happen, and has arranged itself accordingly, the conversational clusters positioned with a sideways vigilance that looked social from the front, and was not social from any other angle. Vivian arrived on the Duke's arm in the blue wool gown she had worn at their wedding, with blue ribbons at her sleeves that Thomas had selected with a solemnity that had made Agnes press her lips together in the doorway. She wore no jewels beyond a small garnet brooch that had been her father's mother's, and that she had kept because it was the size of a secret, small enough to carry without anyone knowing what it cost her to keep it. Cecily Drummond was already in the room, near the fire, positioned with the instinct of a woman who has been rehearsing this evening since Lady Osmond's letter arrived. She was wearing cream and pearls, and had the composure of someone who has been told their position is unassailable, and who has decided to behave accordingly. Lady Osmond was seated in her chair. Her fan was at the measured height. She watched Vivian cross the room with the expression of someone watching a performance move toward the moment it has been constructed to reach. Vivian knew what was coming. She had known since Tuesday, since the cold tea and Mrs. Crane's careful face. And the knowing had not made her afraid in the way she had expected. It had made her very quiet. She crossed to where Mrs. Norris was standing, the elderly woman who had made the name correction at the Pemberton Assembly, and whose voice had always been, in Vivian's experience, the kind that said what others were thinking and could not afford to say. She said good evening to Mrs. Norris and received good evening in return, and a look of the particular warmth reserved for people one has decided are worth one's warmth. The room waited. Lady Osmond did not make her wait long. "Miss Hartley," she said from her chair across the room, in the same pleasant, carrying voice she had used at the Pemberton Assembly. She said it the way she had said it then, as though the correction in between had not occurred. As though the 9 weeks of marriage and the blue ribbons and the garnet brooch were the kind of provisional arrangement that need not alter one's forms of address. Several people near her looked at their hands. Vivian turned. She said, clearly enough to be heard without raising her voice, "I am the Duchess of Ashmore, Lady Osmond." She said it without triumph. She said it the way one states the address of a house one lives in, as plain fact, and the plainness of it was a thing the room felt before it understood, the way one feels a current before one sees the water moving. Lady Osmond's fan stilled, and then, from the far end of the room, she heard Lady Osmond begin again, her voice acquiring the quality it had taken in the morning room at Ashmore, the particular register of a woman who has decided that composure is not sufficient, and that the letter's contents, read aloud, will do what pleasantness has not. She began to speak about the Pemberton Assembly's circumstances, about the nature of the debt, about what the season had understood from the beginning, about the arrangement's character, and the room listened with the sick fascination of crowds that have been waiting for this specific thing. What Lady Osmond had not accounted for was that Thomas was not at Ashmore. He was in the gallery above the room, which was accessible from the back stairs, and which Agnes had agreed to, because Agnes had understood something about the evening that Vivian had not needed to explain to her. He was standing at the railing in his dark coat, with his hands folded on the wood, in the way his father's hands folded. And he was watching. Vivian knew he was there because she had asked him to be. She had said on Thursday evening, while he was selecting the ribbons, "There will be something said at the assembly about how I came to live at Ashmore. I think it is important that you hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." And she had told him, plainly, in the register she used with him now, which was the same register she used for Greek fables, the same one that treated 7 years as sufficient to deserve the truth. He had listened. He had not said anything for a long time. Then he had said, "Did my father know about the debt when he bid?" She had said, "Yes." He had considered this. Then he had said, "Then he chose." She had looked at him. He had gone back to the ribbons. Lady Osmond was still speaking. The words were precise and calibrated, and they were doing the work they had been designed to do. She could see it in the room, in the sideways quality of people's attention, shifting from her face to Lady Osmond's, and back again with the terrible social arithmetic of crowds deciding where to stand. She did not look at the Duke. She had not looked at him since they arrived. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a fire in a room, as a presence registered at the edges of attention without being looked at directly, and she knew, without looking, that he had gone still. She was about to speak. She was going to say, in the same plain voice she had used all evening, that the Pemberton Assembly's circumstances were as Lady Osmond described them, that the debt had existed, that the public occasion of its collection had been as uncomfortable as it had been, that none of this was secret, that she had no interest in pretending otherwise, and that the arrangement it had produced had become in the 9 weeks of its duration the most honest thing in her life, and that she would not apologize for it, or diminish it, or allow it to be diminished in front of the people who had watched it form. She drew breath. The Duke of Ashmore crossed the ballroom floor in 3 strides. The room turned. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided something and finds the deciding restful, and he came to stand beside her with the specific quality of beside that is not decorative, that is structural. That means she was the reason for the movement, and the room could see it and was meant to. He looked at Lady Osmond. He said in the quiet, level voice that did not require volume to carry, "My wife." 2 words. Not a declaration. Not a defense. A correction, the way one corrects a name, because the name was wrong, and the correction was exact. Lady Osmond looked at him. Something crossed her face in the space of a second. A recognition. The kind that arrives when the script one has been following runs out of lines, and in that second she looked older than she had in the morning room at Ashmore, and considerably less certain. He turned to the room. "My wife," he said again, to the 40 persons, and the fire, and the candles, and the girl in cream and pearls near the fire who had gone very still in the particular stillness of a rehearsed thing hitting an obstacle, came to Ashmore with no pretense and no performance and considerable courage, and she has made my son speak. He did not say his ward. He said his son, which was not a slip, which was not imprecision, which was a public decision in the same register as the £5,000, irrevocable and exactly as expensive. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Norris made a sound that was not quite a word. Lady Osmond closed her fan. She did not speak again. She sat for another quarter of an hour in the chair that had always been hers, but it was not the same chair it had been before, because a chair's authority is not in the wood, but in the agreement of the people around it, and that agreement had shifted in the quiet, after those 2 words. She left at 9 o'clock, which was early, and she did not say goodbye to Vivian, and she did not look at the gallery. Cecily Drummond looked once at the Duke, once at Vivian, and looked away with the expression of someone who has understood something they would rather not have understood. She was not cruel. She was 19 and had been told her whole life she was the correct choice, and she was understanding now, publicly, that she was not, and that understanding had a cost Vivian recognized and did not celebrate. She did not look at the gallery because she did not need to. She knew Thomas was there. If you have stayed through this evening and found it worth staying for, leave a word below. There is still one thing remaining, and it is the thing that matters most. They drove back to Ashmore on roads iced over at the edges, and the post-chaise lamps made small orange moons in the dark. And Thomas was asleep against Vivian's arm before they reached the first mile marker. She sat with the weight of him against her side, and looked at the window, and did not speak. And the Duke sat across from her, and looked at her in the way he had been looking at her for weeks, the way the audience had read correctly, and she had not. He said quietly, so as not to wake Thomas, "You were going to speak." She said, "Yes." He said, "What would you have said?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The truth. What I could not have said 9 weeks ago." He looked at her. The lamplight caught the edge of his face. He said, "I know." Ashmore was dark and cold when they arrived, but Mrs. Crane had left fires in the principal rooms and a lamp in the entrance hall, and the house received them with the particular warmth of a house that has been waiting. Agnes carried Thomas upstairs, and he did not wake, and Mr. Pelham had left a note on the schoolroom table saying that Thomas had asked to begin Greek in the new year, which Mr. Pelham would like to flag as significant. Vivian stood in the library and looked at the oaks, which were invisible in the dark, but which she knew were there. She held the garnet brooch in her ungloved hand and felt the metal warm slowly to her palm. She heard the Duke's step in the corridor. She heard it stop outside the library door. She heard quietly the sound of a key in a lock further along the passage. She stood very still, listening, and understood what was being opened. She did not move. She held the brooch and she listened to the fire and the dark, and then she heard his step again, coming back, and he came into the library and stood behind her at the window, where the oaks were invisible, and said nothing for a moment. She said, "I did not expect you to bid." He said, "I did not expect to bid." They were quiet. She said, "She was kind." She was not asking. She had seen the portrait once, briefly, through the briefly open east wing door on her third day at Ashmore, before she understood what wing it was. A woman in blue with Thomas's eyes and a quality of attention in the painted face that she recognized. He said, "She was. I was not always present to see it." The fire shifted. He said, with the restraint of someone removing a weight they have been carrying for long enough that setting it down requires conscious will. "I told myself the estate required attention. It did require attention. The two things are not mutually exclusive, and I have spent 2 years deciding they are, because the alternative is more difficult." She turned from the window. He looked at her in the firelight with the expression she had seen once in the corridor after the library reading. The expression she had not been able to identify from the side. She could identify it now. She had seen it, in varying registers, on her own face. It was the expression of someone who had stopped expecting to be chosen and had not yet learned to receive it. She said, "You chose at the Pemberton Assembly." He said, "Yes." She said, "And tonight?" He said, "Yes." The fire said something in a language of settling wood. Outside the tall windows, snow had begun to fall, the 1st of December, quiet and without ceremony, as if it had been waiting for a moment of sufficient stillness. She put the garnet brooch in her pocket. She said, "Then I think you should stop apologizing to Eleanor and begin here." He was quiet for a long time. She watched him hold the sentence, the way one holds a thing one has needed to hear for a long time and does not immediately know where to put. His face moved once, in the jaw, in the way it moved when something was being released rather than controlled. He said, "Yes." It was not eloquent. It was not a speech. It was the same word he had been using all evening, the same word she had used 9 weeks ago in the private room off the Pemberton Assembly Hall, and it had the same quality now that it had had then, the quality of a door closed and then opened and then left open, which is a different thing from a door that was never closed at all. Spring came to Ashmore the way spring came to estates that had been waiting for it, gradually and then with conviction, the oaks in the avenue finding their leaves over the course of 3 weeks, until the avenue was a green corridor that the morning light moved through in patterns that changed with the hour. Vivian walked it most mornings with Thomas, who had begun talking in the autumn and had not particularly stopped. He talked about Greek and about the oaks and about whether the fox in the fables was clever or whether the crow was more clever and whether Mr. Pelham had been correct that the original Greek made the fox's cleverness clearer, which he had decided Mr. Pelham had been. The east wing door stood open now. Not wide open, not ceremonially, but unlatched, the way a room stands when someone has been in it recently and has left intending to return. The portrait was still there, in blue, with Thomas's eyes. and Vivian did not avoid it or linger over it, but passed the open door the way one passes a room where someone has lived, with the particular attention of a house that holds its people even after they are gone. Mrs. Crane had come to call her Your Grace, with an inflection that was no longer performing. The footman had learned her preferences for the morning household meeting. Mr. Pelham left notes on the library desk that were addressed to both of them. One afternoon in late March, Vivian was at the writing table in the library when Thomas came in from his lesson and sat down in the chair by the window, the same chair, and opened his Greek primer without being asked, and began to read aloud to himself in the careful sounding-out voice of a child, learning that the sounds and the letters are the same country. She did not look up. She listened. The house listened. Outside the window, the oaks were fully leaved, and in the afternoon light, they were the particular green of a thing that has survived a bare winter and knows it. The Duke came in from the estate road at 4 o'clock, as he had come in every day since December, and he paused in the doorway of the library the way he had learned to pause, long enough to take in the room, long enough to find what he was looking for, and then he came inside. Thomas looked up from his Greek. He said, "Father, listen." And he read aloud.